Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Smart City Chronicles podcast. My name is Adam Beck, host of the Chronicles. My day job is Executive Director of the Smart Cities Council for Australia and New Zealand. Welcome to episode 67 of the Chronicles, and this is our first video podcast. So those that are listening via a traditional podcast platform, you'll be hearing us today, but for those on our YouTube channel, you'll also be seeing me and my guest, Kate Isles, in 3D, in real time. And with that, Kate, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Adam, and thank you very much for having me.
No, that's a pleasure. So, Kate, we've got listeners scattered all over the world, different sectors, different places. Some know Australia, some don't. Can you start by giving us a bit of a bio? Who are you and what do you do?
Sure. So, Kate Isles, I'm currently co-director of a firm called Infinitum Partners. I've been in that role for 9 months now. Prior to that, I have been with local government, across development assessment and also strategic planning. And prior to that, I was with the Queensland Reconstruction Authority and had a lot of work in the space of recovery and resilience, which is quite topical at the moment. But also, prior to that, I've been a private sector town planner and private sector development manager. And in my when I'm not at work, I'm at home, married with 2 kids, and also own 2 coffee shops, which again, quite topical at this point in time, given everything that's going on with COVID-19.
Yeah, it's hard to escape the COVID-19 kind of conversation these days, as much as we get into sort of technical areas. I'm going to start. I'm going to start by throwing at you sort of just what comes to mind. How are you feeling, particularly given your history and your previous roles with the Queensland Reconstruction Authority? I mean, how are you feeling at the moment?
It's interesting, I think, and across these, particularly the last couple of weeks, to be brutally honest, last week was a bit of a blur. It was, what does this all mean with the coffee shops, with our consultancy firm, readjusting and having to be adaptive to what everyone's describing as this new normal, which I'll come back to because I think that's an interesting term. But, first and foremost, the coffee shops needed to sort of get them under control. We've got one that's open, one that's closed right at this point in time, and trying to support the team and the staff getting through all of that. At the same time, trying to understand what all of the various announcements mean for us with the coffee shops, but also with the consultancy firm. What does that mean for our clients in the longer term as well? And then on the home front is understanding with the kids in particular, one's in childcare, one is in school, and sort of fluctuating between working and looking after them and obviously being and adhering to all of the government advice. It has been one hectic week. But then over the weekend, when I guess there's some better clarity around what we can and can't do, childcare stimulus, better understanding of the coffee shops and their adaptability, woke up more refreshed this morning in terms of, okay, no, can just get on and get things done, and to really focus in on what we can do as opposed to what we can't do. I think we're all very clear around what we can't do at the moment, but it's more around what we can do to support those businesses, to keep the family afloat. My parents are elderly. They wouldn't like me saying that, but them not being able to see the grandkids in particular has been really difficult. Lots of FaceTime at the moment.
Yeah, a lot of us doing the virtual community meetups as well. I had friends encourage me to join. There's a new app called House Party or something, I think it was. Have you heard of that? Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So that was an interesting experiment. Okay. So can I quickly get you to shift gears for me and put your policy hat on?
Cool.
Okay. What's your take on the policy environment at the moment, the leadership response? You're feeling good, like, are you gritting your teeth? What's your general feeling in terms of how we as a nation have been responding so far?
Oh, look, I think, and it's always one of those topics that can be, there's divergent views out there, but I think overall, I think the leadership has been very good. I think in particular, the Prime Minister put it really well, I thought, the other day when he said, we will do this the Australian way. So whilst there was early on a lot, we're using Singapore and we're using other examples of how we're responding, I think in particular, those announcements last week were very Australian, the JobKeeper in particular, and then following on from that, childcare, I think has been very helpful across the board. I think the communication from leadership has been good. I must admit though, I think like many people probably haven't been watching the news as much, but looking for those key infographics and the stats and the figures around what does the new case look like today? What did it look like yesterday? Is the curve flattening? And I think some of those things are helpful. But then I do turn my mind to things like, and I reflect back on the Queensland Reconstruction Authority at the time, when you go back to January 2011, and
yep.
prior
That's
to...
right. And sorry, Kate, to interrupt. So for those that are listening in and unsure what we're talking about, in January 2011, there was a quite an extensive weather event in the greater sort of southeast Queensland region. Our major water catchment filled up, and we had to sort of let a lot of water out prior to potentially losing control of the storage, and that led to, combined with a whole range of other conditions in place, the ground was very wet and other tributaries feeding into the Brisbane River. It all added up to a flooding of Brisbane City, the third largest metropolis of the nation, which was pretty impactful. So a quick sort of segue there, but that was the January 2019 Brisbane floods. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And even prior to that, though, Adam, we had cyclones up north. So what ended up being the devastating summer of 2010-11, we saw a range of different events that did occur. And yes, the major real event that we saw widespread, we saw Yazi, and then we also saw the floods, but in particular that inland tsunami that came down from Toowoomba and hit the areas of Grantham and Helidon and Whithcott. Those images went round the world. They were global. But what resulted in 2011 was, it was unprecedented back then, but we had the entire state disaster activated under our National Disaster Recovery and Resistance, NDRRA, and that was unprecedented, that we saw the entire state of Queensland declared. And the then Premier, Anna Bligh, was very strong-willed, determined, showed incredible leadership with a level of empathy but focus, and basically set up what was known as the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. At the time, it was set up for, I think it was 3 years was the initial time frame. It is still around today in 2020, and probably more important now than ever as to what role it may play going forward. But I do recall, the authority, the functions and the role, and I went into the role having been tapped on the shoulder. I was given basically 12 hours notice to say, would you like to come over and join the Queensland Reconstruction Authority as the Director of Land Use Planning? And I remember thinking, I don't even know what this is going to mean. But at the same time, earlier on in late 2010, I had actually been out as part of community recovery efforts in areas like Theodore, and that was the first township that was force evacuated because of the rising waters that was coming through. And I thought, well, at that time, it would make a lot of sense for me to take all of that effort in the recovery and being on the ground and translating that into my professional practice, being a town planner, and saying, well, what are we going to learn from this? How could we, or what should we be doing to ensure that these settlements and these townships, when these events do come and go, and we know that floods and cyclones, bushfires will continue all across the country. So what was our role? So I decided very much so to step into that role, and pretty much the next day I walked into what was the Reconstruction Authority headquarters, and we were setting up the Act at the time around what role the Act would have in terms of policy responses. And it was a really, really rewarding time in my career to be part of a myriad of projects that we had done at the time. And in particular, I think that there's two that's probably relevant in terms of some of the COVID-19 responses.
Has this pandemic brought about a new level of understanding, appreciation, awareness around this broader idea as resiliency? I mean, in its true definition, resiliency is really sort of relating to any shock or stress, whether it be natural disaster, economic, social, political, whatever it might be. Certainly, Australia has had its fair share of environmental, climate-related, disasters, shocks, and stresses. With this being a health crisis, does that is there anything different in the idea or the thinking that was, for example, behind the Reconstruction Authority? And I suppose that's the segue to maybe your commentary on today's announcement here in Australia around the new sort of entity in the New South Wales state government called New South Wales Resiliency, or Resiliency New South Wales, I believe. So, so talk to me about sort of the natural disasters, and then sort of where we're at with this health sort of pandemic.
Sure. So I think when we saw the devastating floods and the cyclones that came through, and in particular, there was a huge response from the general public around why did so many homes flood? Why was that? Town planners are to blame. I built above the 1%. I built above the 1 in 100. Just that general understanding of, well, what did that actually mean? And the biggest thing that we saw at that point was the establishment of the Queensland Floods Commission of Inquiry. And the really interesting component of that, from my view, was the level of interrogation that was done at all different levels, from the operation of the dam right through to, well, what is the land use planning? Where are these flood maps? Why were people building on these floodplains? And what we saw through that process was a lot of my colleagues as planners were put on the stand, and they were interrogated as if they were criminals. But what we did see was, I think it was around 175 recommendations that came forward out of that inquiry, of which 70% were directed at local government. A lot of that said, you need to have flood maps, you need to have a range of things. And one thing that we did at the Queensland Reconstruction Authority was we partnered with the likes of the Steve Jacobys, and we looked at what data did the government hold that we could use to start helping some of the most vulnerable communities or smaller regional rural areas, and provide them with at least a baseline of what their floodplains look like. So we did that for the entire state of Queensland, and we delivered that as a service, if you like, to every single local government, because we interrogated it and we found out that the level of flood mapping was not consistent. The response to, if there was flood mapping, how visible was it? Was there a land use planning component that went through that? And so I reflect back on that time, and that was when the Commission's final report came out in 2012. By the time it did come out, we had completed this body of work. And then between now and 2020, we are so much better prepared for any flooding that may actually come through, probably across the state, but because of that particular turn of events.
So So, Kate, just to be clear there, the state government at the time created a body of knowledge, a level of insight that it then passed on to and provided as a service to the 100 and whatever cities and towns across the state. Is that correct?
That's right. So there was 177 at the time.
Yeah.
And we did it across all of the major river basins. And we then went and engaged with every local government and provided them with a suite of these maps as a resource. So we used everything, we sat down with the likes of Steve Jacoby and we went to understand what are the data sets that the state holds that could help us understand, well, where does flooding occur? So we used everything from LIDAR or survey capture through to soil types. And we essentially ran a flood model, if you like, across each of the basins to then at least do a virtual extent or a spatial extent of if flooding was to occur, where could it occur? Now, obviously, there's refinement after refinement that can occur, but you had to start somewhere. And that's what we did. So I think that was a really interesting exercise because what we've then seen is things like the state planning policy respond. And it's not just about the hazard anymore being, well, is it a 1%, is it a 2%? It's also around the risk and what's the risk appetite associated with the hazard itself. So we've seen a fundamental shift, in my view, around the policy response to risk as it relates to land use policy here in Queensland. And in the space of probably 2 or 3 years, that body of work and that momentum that built up, particularly after the Commission's response and their recommendations, that really started to accelerate what that policy response would look like. And I think Queensland's in a far better position now to actually understand that. And then how do we actually adapt to that going forward?
So there's something in my mind that is very, very obvious. Well, in my mind, it's obvious, but doesn't that therefore put Queensland in a really good position to understand and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, at least from a process and data and governance perspective?
Oh, absolutely. I think Queensland, because of the virtue of the state, how we're spatially set out in its own right. I think also the way in which that we do have this body, the QRA that's sitting there that can be utilised and should be utilised. I think the biggest difference though that I see, sorry, just turn that off. The biggest difference I see though is at this point in time, we're not sure what the end game looks like and when we're going to be in a position to understand and realise the full impact of COVID-19. You look at something like Grantham and that came and went and we saw 22 lives lost. We saw those images that went global with the gates of hell where all of that debris in the car body was sitting up against the railway line. That was an event that came and went, and it, as tragic as it was, what happened very quickly after the event was the Premier and the late Steve Jones came out very quickly with a very clear vision, and that was, we want to see some of those people in their new homes on the top of New Grantham by the end of the year. And that vision was set in February 2011. And as the land use planners were sitting there going, okay, so if people are going to be in houses by Christmas, we've now got to work back from that vision and understand exactly what needs to be done. So the problem we've got at the moment is we don't clearly understand what that vision needs to be. We're still trying to understand the extent of the impact. How long is the impact going to be? For businesses like ours, at what point in time do you reopen? Do you reopen in the same way? But then you also look at the policy response, and I'm minded to people like Minister Stokes, who quite clearly came out saying, with the COVID-19 response at the moment, it's quite explicit around what we can't do, but planning by its nature it's our duty to understand what we can do and what we can do now. And that's where I think we're seeing some exciting things coming forward around what we can do to help with this. And in particular, sort of start focusing on what the recovery may look like. We just don't know the extent of the recovery that we may need to do.
Yeah, okay. And we're going to pivot into planning and plan tech and e-planning in a moment. Last one around governance and the like, the announcement today, Resiliency New South Wales, I think the new agency is called. What went through your mind when you heard that announcement?
I don't think it was unexpected. I thought something like that may occur. And I also think, we can't forget the impact and what has happened with those bushfires. And they're the images that went global. Again, not dissimilar to Grantham. There are still people who are reeling out there, particularly businesses. But I think what it has done, and to sort of circle back to your other question, is when you look at, and I've done some work in the insurance space, and one of the big things the insurer asks are things like, well, what's your greatest articulated risk? Now, in areas like Wellington, that would be an earthquake. But then you start to look at, well, what is the greatest articulated risk? And COVID-19 seems to be doing a pretty good job of taking that step. So we've always maintained good risk structures and plans, and pandemics have always been on the cards. I just don't think any of us sort of had preempted, even your Bill Gates of the world, preempted the global scale of this particular event and what that actually means. So the New South Wales Resilience One, I think it's great that it's called resilience, and I think that's really key that word resilience is used. The Queensland Reconstruction Authority at the time, reconstruction was important because there was a need to rebuild and reconstruct physically. But there was always this notion that it was going to take a role, and that was also because there was a time period that was put onto the authority in the first instance. But even when I was on the board of the QRA, there was a far bigger focus around the resilience and Queensland's resilience strategy and this notion of betterment, so that when these things do occur, how do we become, what's the betterment part? What's the value proposition that comes through that says, well, we're just not going to allow that to occur again. So, not just getting money to rebuild the road back to the standard it was before the event. What can we do to actually rebuild it so it does have a level of resilience in it? So if the same event occurred, maybe it might withstand that next event. And I think some of those key policies, and I think Shane's appointment, Shane Fitzsimmons' appointment to that authority is a good one. Talk about leadership. He through the bushfires, he was exceptional, absolutely exceptional. And I think it does mean something when there's someone in uniform. We looked at Major General Slater, who was the first chair of the authority out there in Queensland across his images went global as well, because he was on the ground, he was in uniform, and it was called Operation Queenslander. And that's how the QRA first responded, through Operation Queenslander. Setting it up, what do these recovery plans look like? Understanding that every area had been impacted quite differently. So it wasn't just going to be a stock standard response. And I think that's probably also what we're going to see across the board. We're already seeing stimulus packages, whether that's local government, federal or state, coming through, and they're all a little bit different, but probably fundamentally they're quite similar.
Yeah. Okay. Let's change tack and talk planning for a moment. So it must be, in the last 10 days alone, I've been involved in many different conversations and webinars and discussions and dialogues, and I'll just throw a couple of sort of points and topics that stick with me in terms of, I continue to hear these, there's certainly repetition here. So I hear that things aren't going to be the same. Sometimes to the extent that everything's going to change. I hear questions being asked, really interesting ones. What does land use look like after this? A lot of people think it's a health and it's an economic issue, but what does land use look like? And I think that stems from, in part, we pretty much got the whole nation teleworking at the moment. A lot of people are working geographically in places they are not normally used to each day. At home, potentially in suburban settings. That a lot of the conversation for me has been, the city centre or the downtown is quite dead, but the suburbs are thriving, the local coffee shop. So there's this really interesting kind of ball of issues around small business, neighbourhoods, the suburbs, working from home, mobility, public transportation, a whole bunch of issues, real good, solid planning kind of issues. So that's the introduction to my question. And the question is, from one planet to another, although I haven't practiced for a long time, what's going to change? When we get out of this, what's going to change?
Oh, it's been mulling around for some time. And look, I don't think that there's anyone who's got a crystal ball. But what I can say is that not only do I think things will change, I think things have to change. I don't think it's about what the new normal is. I just think there'll be areas like basic things. So people who have got big offices in the CBD and they're going, hang on, half of my workforce can work from home, it's productive. So my lease is going to come up and I want half the space. It's then the practicalities of, the work from home, I think, is an interesting one, and we can come back to that. But the way in which everyone's saying what's actually happening in the suburbs, and I think that will be interesting going forward. And I'm loving the fact that we're in a home and we're right next to the local shops, and we're down there pretty much every day buying the loaf of bread. And but we're also probably feeling like we have to buy it locally because there's sort of this push on for supporting local. I think that there is a bit of a push away from the big boys. And I think, and a lot of people are saying this, is that it's taken this type of event to see people support locally because they feel now obligated to support locally. You're also seeing things like, and I think the Queensland response in particular around manufacturing and the supply chains is a really interesting one too. The adaptability of those businesses, from our favourite, the Bundaberg distillery, doing all of the ethanol for the hand sanitizer, to the local Fonzie Abbott doing exactly the same thing, to businesses just having to move so quickly. The areas right near you, which have only just opened up, those great new restaurants that are now all closed, but they've gone bang straight into takeaway. And yes, they've laid off staff, but they have been adapted. So I think that there's just going to be a fundamental change, in particular around how restaurants and bars and others use their space. Do they have to have that such a big area anymore? Probably not. Speaking to some of the local restaurants, they say, actually, we're doing okay. But the level of support has been what supported them. And I then wonder, how long can that level of support last? I mean, I think we all feel a little bit obligated at the moment to continue to spend locally. But at a point in time, that will start to run out in terms of the willingness to do so. But also, I just think people are going to be far more frugal around their own spending. And we're going to start to probably realise, what do we actually really need? I think it's going to fundamentally change retail. And I think the biggest people who are going to be affected are probably commercial and retail in a tenancy sense.
Yeah. I I no doubt imagine that in the long list and portfolio of various stimulus or stimuli that are going to come through and continue to come through from our government and other governments around the world, um, there'll be that moment, and I've heard little murmurings of this. When we, there's the instant sort of hemorrhaging that we need to stop. Instant relief, sort of pivot, adapt. Then there's sort of the rebuild, right, and the recovery. I've heard that what can be the role of infrastructure? Can we bring the pipeline forward, right? Because it's all about stimulus and jobs and moving money through the economy. So this sort of really leads us to what I've been reading over the last few weeks in terms of building a greater efficiency in our planning process. It's interesting watching the cities, right? A lot of the city responses and packages of support I've noticed from city to city have kind of been a loosening of red tape or waiving of fees, real low hanging fruit. So I just wonder now, this in particular, this sort of concept and approach of e-planning being a way in which we can, well, in some senses it's a no-brainer, but just put that aside for a moment. Some are still not doing it, and maybe need to be convinced. But this whole world we're living in at the moment is kind of demanding efficiency, isn't it? And I think it's certainly highlighting the silly things maybe that we were doing in the past that we didn't realize, the really inefficient things, and planning is kind of the gatekeeper to the city, right? In a lot of ways, in terms of you can't do this, you can do that, you can do this only based on that. What does our rebuild look like for planning? The role of e-planning in helping us, sort of build back, more thriving communities and cities.
Look, I think that there is a significant window of opportunity right here, right now, across both state and local governments. We've written a couple of pieces already on this because we do feel that it's always been around right development, right location, but there's also an element in particular now that relates to the right time. And there's everything from your low-hanging fruit, and this is the opportunity to say, well, why is that even in the system? Why is that even triggering an application? And I harp on this because I'm in Queensland, but I look at New South Wales and I go, why is a skylight in a townhouse essentially triggering what we would say is an impact assessable application here in Queensland? It's probably adding at least 25, if not 30 grand to a process that's to put a skylight into a townhouse. But then you take that same analogy and you push it all the way through and you say, and don't get me wrong, I'm one for the appropriate community engagement, and that is so important. But what we now need to work out is that balancement, and this sort of starts to talk to the piece around the vision, around what does this look like afterwards? Is there a vision that this is around jobs, employment, and is that the key piece of this resilience that we're going to go through? Is it continuity? We're seeing various people respond around continuity, whether that's relaxing construction hours in New South Wales, but you're seeing other areas across the globe that are in full lockdown, so construction activity isn't happening. We're seeing some councils come out saying, we want to see some stimulus around certain types of development. And then we start to say, well, what does that certain type of development look like? So I think there's ways in which people can rip that Band-Aid off very quickly and go, okay, here's the opportunity. But the opportunity, in my view, isn't just to rip it off because we just want to fast track stuff. It's to rip it off to ensure that we are value adding to that policy process. And this is where I get excited as a planner to go back to the first principles of planning And it's not just about, the pub test, or what we would say is the career mail test, the development on the front page of the paper. Does that work or not work? It's, is it something that I would be happy for my grandma to come and visit because I had my stamp on that? I think we need to approach this very pragmatically, but still do it like Grantham. You kind of need to act relatively swiftly. And 80% of the time we will get this right. And the other 20%, well, it's COVID-19. We're all dealing with something that's completely unprecedented. But if we can come up with the criteria for 80% of the things and start, and it's not just about fast tracking that, because you still want the efficiency, you still want the transparency, and you still very much want integrity and accountability as part of this process. But you've got a private sector who is struggling. You've got public sector who, capacity may be deterred because we're doing the delivering of the recovery, or the response at the moment, dealing with response. But here's the opportunity. I mean, I look at local governments across the board, and you just look at their budgets, and I don't think I've seen one stimulus that hasn't talked about rates freeze or rates rebate or deferral or whatever it might be. So local governments are going to need to look at what their sources of revenue will be. Now, in the majority of circumstances, your second highest, your revenue comes through construction and development. That's the application fees for it, and then it's the infrastructure charges and also the donated assets that will come through. So it doesn't surprise me that you're seeing Minister Stokes announce the accelerated planning system, and I think that's a good thing. I do think, though, that this is sort of comes to that e-planning piece, is that there are already platforms, and there's a myriad of platforms already out there that could be utilised to self-serve this process. If you can come up with the criteria relatively quickly, get that into the system, use the private sector to come through, instead of having 25 odd development controls for certain types of development, you bring that down to the 6 that really matter. And if it meets car parking heights, setbacks, the things that probably matter to the community members the most, then surely we should be able to push it through and go, right, here's your decision, you're good to go. And again, I know that sounds probably fairly simplistic, but there are ways in which we can do this. And I think e-planning as an enabler of that, and it's about facilitation, not regulation right now. But you've got to facilitate right development, right location, and is it the right time for that type of development? And I'd hazard a guess there's not too many that wouldn't fit that boat. But this isn't about people trying to game the system right now about rezonings or whatever it might be. There's got to probably be another suite of criteria that those sorts of projects could go through a separate vetting type process. But I think the focus on that's really important.
Is there going to be a tension between, as you've alerted, raising revenue and building greater efficiency into the system? I mean, can you? I think it's clearly, and I agree with you. I think it's going to be very clear that coming out of this and getting through this, we're still in it, of course, that doing more with less is going to become the mantra, surely. I'd imagine that there must be a number of cities, running the numbers on where the lost revenue is going to be, or, where they can sort of be innovative and make that up. I mean, if you were back in government, local government, what would be the things rattling around in your mind to try and, optimize that sort of dilemma or tension?
Yeah, I think I think everyone needs to be careful around understanding the decisions that are being made now won't be paid for in the next 2 years, 3 years. It'll be 5 to 10 years. So whilst councils, and I would hope, and I would imagine the majority of them are doing those and running those numbers. Importantly, here in Queensland, we're just coming out of local government elections. Most of those haven't been declared yet. Entering into a budget cycle where there is an immediate feeling of, I need to support our community. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for that. But local government is only one player in this space.
Yeah.
So if on one hand we're looking at development application fee reductions or infrastructure charges reductions, how does that actually work in with what the state might do around land tax and relief on land tax? It's got to be a coming together of all of these so that the levers that local government can pull are working in song with whether it's state, whether it's with federal, so that it does actually have a meaningful impact. But we can't waive everything, because the long-term financial position of a local government, of a state government, it will be our kids who will ultimately be paying for this. So we want to set it up so that, yeah, sure, there's some stimulus, but this is also around that long-term financial sustainability as we move towards what this long-term resilience may look like. Because who knows when a COVID-20 or when another cyclone or something, another devastating impact might come through. Going back through droughts, the role of climate change going forward and it being back on the table, but also moving towards a more renewable future. And that's where I think the other exciting component comes through. And so, if I was back in local government, I would be very seriously considering my own assets, the role that they could play in stimulating this. I know that there's been in the past this sort of notion of you can't sell off assets, and that, and you've got to be careful around that. Don't get me wrong, again, but at the same time, here is this unprecedented moment. So if there is an underlying government asset that's sitting there and it can be used to part stimulate and ensure, because there will be continue to be downward pressure on rates, but at some point something's going to have to pay. So either rates are going to go up or your revenue stream needs to come in from elsewhere, and majority of that will come from development and construction, but it can also come from re-looking at assets, the role that the assets might play, the leasing of those assets, the licensing, or ultimately the disposal of those assets. So if I was advising local government, I'd be very clearly looking at that. And then I think it would be around a lot of those tax reliefs. But some councils are financially very strong. Majority of them were already sitting pretty close to the line in any event. So I think it's going to take some real collaboration across the board, not just local and state, but also federally, to ensure what does this look like long-term financially.
Yeah. And on that point, small business for Australia, and I would imagine elsewhere around the world, small business is just such a significant contributor to the national economy. It's a really interesting one. There's kind of a data set that seems to continue to elude local government. It's coming through in a survey that we're doing at the moment, and a number of conversations has certainly identified this as an issue, which is we don't know what businesses are closing down and where, right, in any sense of kind of real time. And that would be really useful data right around about now when we're trying to craft stimulus and support packages and things like that. How just on that one, as a planner, I mean, how might we overcome that one? How might we learn and get, or there's probably still time. I mean, we still don't have a vaccine for this thing, so we don't know how long small business is going to be impacted. But I mean, if the mayor was to come along to you were still in local government and said, I want to know how many and where local business is shutting down, sort that one for me, Kate. Where do you kind of start the process?
Well, it's interesting because I was only talking about this to someone the other day, Adam, because with our 2 coffee shops, the only person who would know which one's open, which one's closed, who we've let off, who we've kept on board, have we gone for JobKeeper or are they on JobSeeker, would be our accountant.
Yeah.
And so there's a range of things, people are sort of thinking around, well, what are the platforms that people are using to do their books? I think it's QuickBooks and the other accounting.
Xero or something. Yeah.
Xero,
yeah.
Xero, to see what sort of data's been held there. But I think and look, it may come through with the JobKeeper as well, whether there was just a few other questions that could be asked when people were registering for that. There's over 350,000 businesses that have registered for JobKeeper.
Wow.
But just to understand, well, are you applying? Are you still open? Yes or no? If you are, how many staff? What does the operations look like? Oh, and by the way, I noticed that you're a restaurant. Are you now just doing takeaway only? So I think there will be a catalogue of that. But then you come back down to, well, in my local area here in Albion, I go, well, I know that one's open, but they are doing this differently. And it's really just sort of walking the pavement.
Yeah.
And you kind of, if I was in local government, and I do know that, majority are working from home, it's still an essential service. Adhering to social distancing is, deploying a team. And again, I reflect back on the QRA, and we at the QRA, we developed the rapid damage assessment program, which was on a handheld device. You could go out and you were basically traffic lighting the level of damage for a particular house, whether that was cyclone, whether it was flood. Okay, well, it was flooded. Is it still being able to be occupied? No. If, what's the severity? And this system was then able to be revisited on a weekly or a monthly basis, so that we kind of knew at what point in time. And it's now been deployed ever since it was sort of constructed back in 2012. Go out rapidly, and then people have got the numbers for the press conferences, and we know that 20 homes are currently uninhabited because the flood level came up above the electrical system. Something like that. But I'm also looking at the range of businesses that are just who are adapting. And I look at the valuers, for instance, and I saw Heron Todd White the other day, and how they've deployed this new platform that they're using, so that people, their valuers are just going to the outside of the property, but the residents inside are able to essentially go around and video the room and have clear instructions around what to do. An app that's deployed, that could be deployed out to businesses to very quickly say, well, and by the way, how are you going? Because I think the other big thing is people have just been trying to understand, my case study looks like this. I'm a hairdresser, and I've got, I'm the owner, or I've got 2 employees there full time. I've got 1 part time, and then I've got 8 casual. 4 of those have been with me for 12 months, but the other 4 haven't. Can someone please try and explain to me quite easily, what does this all mean to me? But everyone is grappling with this, and I think they're saying a lot of people are at the front line at the moment. That accountants are probably at the most front line at the moment. They're working around the clock to try and grapple with this, to get the BAS in so that people are getting this instant relief. But small business is going to suffer, and it has suffered enormously. But I'm buoyed by how many people have very quickly pivoted their business models, and a lot of them are coming going, no, we need to continue on and we'll soldier on. And I'm loving seeing people sold out. But I just don't think that that's sustainable.
No.
In the long term, it won't be.
No. So, last question, Kate. What? This question used to be a straightforward one. It's a little bit challenging to answer now. I used to say, what are you excited about over the next 12 months? So what can you tell me about the next sort of 10 to 12 months? Is there something you're looking forward to? Glass half full,
Well, look, I think even when we first started seeing COVID, and I'm probably in a little bit of a unique position because I have a brother, sister-in-law and family who live in Seoul in South Korea. So I'm seeing Seoul, really returning to businesses as usual as it could have been. Social distancing, everything's still being adhered to. The cherry blossoms have just come out, and you're starting to see economic reports coming through around markets improving in a range of things. So I'm optimistic because I have that particular lens. I'm also optimistic because I think Australia, by its nature of being an island and everything that we've put into place, I'm buoyed by the fact that we haven't been placed into a full lockdown. I like the fact that there has been an element and an undercurrent of, you've got to be careful what you wish for, and that there's this element of we need to keep the economy driving. And I think because we've done that, we have actually been able to see businesses adapt very quickly to what it is that they can do to continue to keep people employed, but to go, oh, hang on, here's an opportunity for me to be challenged and to try something that I didn't think, well, I was going to try it, but I was going to try it in probably 12 or 18 months' time. And I think the same thing resonates for our profession as planners and planners contributing to COVID and the response. I think we've talked about planning and disruption around planning, I don't know, for probably a decade now, Adam. It's it's the Blockbuster, it's the Kodak. And I think what I'm really excited about is the e-planning journey and technology providing and supporting the solution to enable planners to be planners, to concentrate on being planners rather than being regulators, using the technology to support the decision-making process, to bring forward efficiency, but to also allow 24/7 connection. And I think that's the big thing, is that we're still sitting in PDFs. We're not sitting in an interactive environment. We're not, some people are better than others, don't get me wrong, they certainly are. But, a really easy thing like the floodplain maps would be to see e-planning lead the way, and for planning schemes to be put online, and for development assessment processes from the e-lodgement all the way through. I think there's a huge opportunity. And if in 12 months' time we're having this conversation and e-planning hasn't been front and centre of this response, then I will be deeply disappointed. And I also don't think that we, as people who are in these sorts of roles, are not championing. I think we will be doing a very big disservice to ourselves, to the profession, and then more broadly to the community.
I was reminded of our last episode, the interview I did with Neil Glentworth. I asked him a question around, who needs to sort of take leadership responsibility sort of for all these things that we want done. And he just said, you, Adam, it starts with you, you got to get that done. So Kate, we got to commit that we'll make that happen. But for now, we got to sort of wrap it up there. Thanks so much for joining us. No doubt the next little while, medium term, is going to be of strong interest to you professionally, but also as a small business owner and a parent as well. But thanks for carving out some time in your diary today and joining me on the Chronicles podcast.
Appreciate it.
So, folks, that was our guest, Kate Isles. She's one of the directors to Infinitum Partners, based here in Brisbane, a planner. Also, as you heard, extensive knowledge with rebuilding, reconstruction, and all things bouncing forward after shock and stress. For those that aren't subscribing to the Chronicles, you can do so. Head to whatever platform it is that you go to, the place, Spotify, iTunes. We'll be there. Just look up the Smart Cities Chronicles. You can also head to our website, smartcitieschronicles.com. All our episodes are there. Until next episode, keep well, stay healthy, and we look forward to bringing another episode shortly.